Just kind of listening to some of you as you've been talking. A couple of questions that perhaps ought to be addressed. One had to do with transportation. How do you feel about that now? You want to dig more?
Well, it just sounds like the transportation system's not that good.
Hey, you're right. Eric may want to have something to say about transportation. I don't know how it impacts environment and so on. A number of you have said to me, what is AIM all about? That you want to hear a little bit about that sometime. Maybe we can do that tonight, maybe not, it doesn't matter. But I think the other thing that we do want to hear a little bit about is the whole kind of umbrella for this. If you want to put it under an umbrella, it might be environmental impact, which can be a sort of a broad and very specific category all at once. And we do have a guy who knows a little bit about that with us, who's been chairing the thing and adding some good questions here and there. But if you can hang in there, let's listen to Eric for a little bit, and we'll move on from there.
It's sort of a dubious distinction to be last on this very, very full day, and
it's been getting better every percent.
Yeah, as full a day as it's been for you, it's been that full for me. So I'll save us both a little trouble and try to be as brief as I can. And if you have questions as I'm going on, please ask them. When anybody talks about environmental impact, and as Bill just said, does transportation come within that? Well, of course it does. Everything comes within it, and I'll just try to very briefly describe within 15 minutes or so what and why environmental impact and why the emphasis on it today. One of the very basic reasons is because our environment is obviously deteriorating. I don't have to tell any of you that. That's obvious if you look out the window or if you drive your car or if you do anything. In response to that, in response to other pressures, there was an act passed in 1970 that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and it was called the National Environmental Policy Act. It was a major piece of legislation, and the act has initiated substantial changes in our nation's environmental consciousness and in the goals and objectives and how we approach them. This is true whether we like it or not. It's a very far-reaching act, and many people who have or who did back it now are beginning to doubt whether they did the right thing. And let me read you just one little brief thing from it. This is from NEPA then, which is an abbreviation for that act. One of the passages states, to declare a national policy which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment, to promote efforts which will prevent and eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere, and to stimulate the health and welfare of man, to enrich the understanding of the ecological systems and national resources' importance to the nation. Now, there's not much in there that anyone except the most stalwart conservationist could object to. Everybody would listen to that and say, dependent upon what age bracket you are in, groovy or right on or terrific or that's wonderful. And I think we really ought to go forward from there. And so people took that for what it was worth, not assuming it was worth much. But there is a specific section within the National Environmental Policy Act, and that is Section 102(2)(c) specifically, and that asks for environmental impact statements. And I'll just read you what is required. And the whole issue of environmental impact statements transcends new town development, but is an integral part of new town development. And what NEPA requires in this specific area is the following. 1, the environmental impact of the proposed action, and 2, any avoidable adverse effects of that action, and 3, the relationship of short-term uses and long-term productivity, and 4, any irreversible and irretrievable commitments of resources. Now, once again, everybody would probably say, that sounds great too. And since the passage of NEPA, and since a number of people had to read Section 102(2)(c) and comply with it, and what is required is that any action that requires federal funding must have an environmental impact statement with it. And who prepares the environmental impact statement depends upon what area of expertise each federal or organization or agency is responsible for. So that if one were building a bridge, the Coast Guard or the Highway Department would get together and prepare an impact statement. That statement theoretically would be reviewed by other federal agencies that have expertise in that area, It would come back to the Coast Guard and or Highway Department in this case. The statement would then go to the Council of Environmental Quality, who would look at it and file it. And whether or not anybody adheres to that impact statement or not really doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference today. But this is the procedure. I've been working in this area for about a year or a year and a half, and I have never seen what I would consider to be an adequate impact statement. They are, by and large, useless. This isn't to sound like I'm saying, in a Socrates-like fashion, questioning what is done. It's pretty well decided that that's the case. There was recently a meeting held for the AAAS meetings, which are held in Christmas, and they had a whole session on NEPA and impact statements, and everyone came to the same conclusion. Oh my God, they aren't worth anything. Why aren't they? What can we do? But one of the problems is that they use terms like the quality of human life, and in the Council of Environmental Quality's last report, which was their third annual report, they discussed the Section 102C in the following terms. They talk about, they go, let me just read this and I'll explain it. Both terms, major and significant, and these are two terms that are used in that section, are relative, calling for a reasonable exercise of judgment in light of the NEPA policy. Because the Section 102.2c requirement is addressed to the agency which must initially decide the applicability of the terms in light of its knowledge of the nature and effects of its programs. And so, what is major and what is significant? People really don't know that. People really don't know what an impact statement is or should be. And there are a number of very specific things that should be incorporated into impact statements that aren't. And maybe I can discuss those briefly before talking about Columbia for a few minutes. Before talking about impact statements, one would naturally think that a statement should be included that describes the natural or pre-existing conditions of the environment. By that I mean if you're going to determine the impact of a road, or you're going to determine the impact of housing on siltation, or you're going to determine the impact of a shopping center on particular geological formations, one would have to know what is there prior to the impact, or you're really discussing impact in a vacuum. Is that sort of clear? The reason I want to make that very clear is I have not seen any impact statements that have included any decent inventory material. That is, I've not seen any impact statements that include and integrate and analyze the geological and soils and vegetative and wildlife considerations, except in the usual boilerplate. I'm sorry, that's a term that's used for companies that come out with proposals. They have a boilerplate thing and they just stamp in the different names and shove the damn thing in and hope they get funded. And it's the usual amorphous boilerplate, so that there is very, very little that is known about the pre-existing environment. And then, if you don't know that, and you then decide to determine what the adverse effects or the impact is of a proposed action, you're really not talking about a damn thing, because you don't know what the effects are going to be. But people do that. And then they go on to relate those specific effects with the uses that are going to be employed, and they come up with some subjective criteria that, by the way, even at that level don't have to be adhered to. The only comprehensive impact statement that was prepared, and that left something to be desired, was a two-stack volume on the transatlantic Alaska pipeline. Regardless, Morton made a subjective decision. Whether or not he agreed or didn't agree made no difference. He made a decision. The facts might not have dictated that. So even if one were to have all the baseline ecological data that one would need, the last decision becomes a value decision, a decision that is made by the political or the whatever type of leadership you have in a particular area. What is being done right now with impact statements is an attempt to put them in some sort of a matrix or a series of matrices that relate the adverse impact to the pre-existing conditions of the environment, to the uses, and come up with a series of trade-offs and alternatives, technological alternatives, that can be used by the decision makers. One of the things that's absolutely essential as far as I'm concerned is involving the community in this process. Everybody wants to involve the community because that's another thing you're supposed to do. But I think, if you could write an impact statement or formulate matrices, and we've done some of these. Time doesn't permit now to bring them here, but if any of you are interested in this area, I'd be happy to give them to you at some other time. Formulate matrices that can be quantified and can be understood by people so that the trade-offs are clear, both the economic trade-offs and the ecological trade-offs. And that's another big problem. Environmentalists and conservationists are just as guilty as developers and builders in trying to put forth their particular point of view. And neither one considers what the other one is doing. For example, if someone owns an island, and that island on the market is worth $4 million, which is the case in many times is the case, the environmentalists say, I want that island to be left with the way it is. I don't want it to be touched because you don't understand. It's a productive mangrove swamp, and if this estuary is destroyed, the little fish can't, blah, 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 which is true. And the guy who owns the island usually says, I agree and I empathize, and if you pay me $4 million, I won't touch the damn island. And that's what it comes down to. The conservationists usually say, but you don't understand. And the builder says, and the developer or the owner says, you don't understand. And they're both right. Neither understands. And so what has to be done is to incorporate all the meaningful data, and there's a way of doing this, into a matrix. And this matrix then can be worked into establishing trade-offs so that one tries to consider what is most beneficial to the community. And community pressure, if used properly, can truly affect these particular changes. There's no question about it, but no one's tried to do it effectively. Yeah. That's very general, and I'm trying to keep this very brief. In Colombia, as you know, there's no federal financing, so there's really no need for impact statements. But a number of private organizations, including HRD, feel the need to do something that looks like it's ecologically oriented. And what they tried to do in Colombia was set up a series of guidelines, and they're called the Architectural Guidelines for Residential Construction. I believe that someone had mentioned them earlier. The architectural guidelines have been revised about 3 or 4 times. Whether or not you're philosophically in agreement with the principle is not for me to discuss right now. But what they do discuss is the specific design criteria for homes, the specific slope that your driveway can be on, the specific amount of drainage that is allowed, and erosion, and so forth. Most of them are clear-cut. Most of them can be adhered to without annoying the residents. But one of my favorite beefs, and I might as well bring it up, is a major section of the architectural guidelines, and that's the tree preservation procedures. The tree preservation procedures were established so that this community would look as if it weren't, I think it was your point, it didn't all look the same, but there were trees and it would look as if it had been around for a while. And I had a very elaborate procedure for saving trees. It had been revised about 4 or 5 times, and it was finally written by one of the nation's tree physiologists. It was a brilliant document. And they said exactly how the trees should be saved. That the trees that were marked red during the development process would be saved, the ones that were marked white would have to go, and the ones that were marked yellow might go and might be saved, depending upon how they did it. One of the troubles with Colombia, when talking about environmental impact, is that people believe that. And, you know, had you been told that what you'd have to do to save your trees was sit in front of the bulldozer, it would be better than this. So what happened was the trees that were marked white went, and the trees that were marked yellow went, and a lot of the trees that were marked red went. And, you know, being a little irate and a little crazy about my trees, because we all sort of like them around here, I went up to the developer and I said, you know, that's really not what you're supposed to do, because you said they're supposed to stay. And the developer said, you're right, we made a mistake. I said, yeah, but you made a mistake, and I was asked to be a spokesman by a number of community groups here, and making a mistake really isn't enough, because that's a 70-foot shagbark hickory. On any market value, it would cost $40,000 or $50,000 if you calculated what a 6-inch in diameter small tree cost to put in. So what do you mean you're making a mistake? He said, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And I'm talking about commitment now, and I'm talking about Colombia, by the way. Let me preface what I say. Colombia probably is doing more in this area than most other new towns, and this is what Colombia is doing. I finally managed to get out of the developer a copy of a contract between the builder and the developer that stated specifically, the developer being HRD, that the builder had to adhere to the architectural guidelines for residential construction prior to any building that would go on in Columbia, which meant that if he didn't do that, he could be sued. I got that. It took me a long time to get that document. And I went up to the developer with it, and I said, hey, look, you know, you're going to be sued. This is really terrible. And the developer said, you're right. It's the worst thing I've ever seen. I'm going to talk to them. And he talked to them, and of course the trees kept coming down. And one of the problems that was really amazing was that had they tried a little bit, they could have preserved the trees. But they couldn't afford to do it. I don't blame the developer, and I don't blame the builder, but we each have our axe to grind. They couldn't afford to do it because the builder said, we're a mass development builder. If we take care of the trees like this Newtown nut is asking us to, it's going to cost us too damn much money, and we're going to get out of Columbia. And the developer said, you know, you're right too. And it was a matter of just sort of letting the thing go along. And the situation right now is that trees are still not safe here, and they're still starting to go down. That's one specific area. There are other things such as erosion, siltation, where very rudimentary silt ponds are still being established in Columbia, and we still have erosion and we still have siltation, although it is improving from village to village. The same philosophy that you've heard before, well, in the next new town we're going to consider, and in the next new town we're going to, it doesn't really suffice if you live in this particular new town. One of the problems that I think the Rouse Company and other developers, and this applies to everybody throughout the nation, is guilty of is not using pre-existing data. And this is something that you all ought to seriously consider because it's incredible. There are maps put out by the Soil Conservation Service, which is part of the Agriculture Department, by the Geological Service. There are topographic maps put out. There are aerial surveys. There is enough biological and ecological data put out right now, and I'm sure you're all familiar with Ian McCarr. And that's all Ian McCarr did. And I'll say it's all he did. It was really something. He took all this data and he analyzed it. And he had overlays to decide what should be preserved and what should be developed and what should be conserved and where highways should go and what amenities should be saved and shouldn't be. But no one uses that data. Most people don't know it's available, and most people wouldn't know what to do with it even if they found it. There is very little new research that has to be done. It's true something like vegetative type mapping, which means going into the field and determining what trees are there or aren't there, or some animal surveys would have to be done in most areas. But this inventory data that I was referring to before is available and would take no more than a month or two to do for any substantial PUD or new town. But it isn't being done, and the commitment isn't there yet. I do believe that Columbia is as far ahead, I guess, as any new town in this area. I also believe that with NEPA and environmental impact statements and the pressure that is coming from the government and from the citizenry, this will be forthcoming in the future, but it really isn't here now. And I'll ask for questions. Yeah.
Are there people being trained to do this kind of thing? Very environmental things, quality development, anywhere?
Yeah. Under McCarg at the University of Pennsylvania, and at schools of design, for example, in Virginia, North Carolina State, North Carolina, and I'm sure other places throughout the country. It's similar or analogous to what Jim Wanamaker was saying. You can't really train anybody to do that. The type of person who can do it is never in a position to implement it. He's usually coming in from the outside and doesn't follow the process through. However, there are people being trained to think this way, this so-called ecological approach, and people are becoming aware of the data that is available, and I think they will be using it. It's a slow process like anything else.
So,
Well, what difference would it make if you could use this information and put it in an environmental impact statement if they just send it to someplace and then file it? Other than creating pressure that if enough people did it, it may count. But
Well, it depends on how the statement was used. You're talking about a federal impact statement. Yeah. Well, CEQ, the Council of Environmental Quality, does just file it, but they file selectively. I should have gone into that. 99% of them are filed. If they respond to impact statements it's totally contingent upon what community or residential or political pressures apply. They'll pull one out quickly and say it's no good and send it back, and people will pay attention to it. But when they're talking about new towns and they're talking about private impact statements, which are becoming available now, and right now you're right. Not a hell of a lot is done. But I'm sure that with continued pressure and continued awareness of ecological concerns, then it's going to have to be more of a major issue in the next few years. People will have to take note of it.
And my other question is, okay, now am I right to assume that the developer does the environmental impact statement, right?
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
Well, then what good would it do when he does it? I mean, there would be no, as far as he's concerned, a lousy statement is good because then they don't follow up on it, and there's no complaints.
Well, hopefully he doesn't review his own statement.
Yeah.
If federal funding is involved, his statement goes to HUD or wherever the federal funding comes from, that they have to pass on it, review it, and send it back and say this isn't adequate or this is adequate. In private development, you really don't have that control except for community pressure, but you don't allow the developer to do it. What he usually does is hire consultants in from the outside, and you have to hope that these guys aren't going to be bought off, but a lot of them are.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's life.
I would think that the state pollution control agencies, the state environmental agencies should begin to demand.
Yes,
development.
it's happening. I should have said that. Regional planning councils and other state agencies are demanding impact statements, but once again, the impact statements aren't any more significant than those demanded by the federal government. They really don't amount to a hill of beans. No one knows how to interpret them. No one knows how to read them. No one knows whether they should or shouldn't pay attention to them.
Very few.
Very few.
I was wondering if you know of any. I've seen the Woodlands environmental impact statement, which is done by McCarg. It seemed to be a very good statement. But I'm dubious about the next step, whether it can be accepted as a good statement, but then how it affects the development. I've seen developers disregard a good environmental impact statement because they don't know how to apply the information in it, and or they don't want to. They make the decision to ignore it. For economic reasons, essentially.
That goes back to the initial point of having to hire an outside consultant to do this. The guy comes in, gives you his advice, and leaves, and then you can do with it or not with it. It's similar to that initial work group type of thing that the Rouse Company had, and when these people left, they went ahead, maybe not regardless, but they went ahead. And so, when you talk about real commitments, somebody has to be hired, or some group has to be hired, at least on a once-a-year basis to follow this. You're absolutely right. But that costs a lot of money.
Isn't it part of the planning team's responsibility too? I've seen the environmental impact statement being developed on one level and the landscape architect doing his land use plan on another with no interaction.
Yeah, but certain things are more essential than others. Some of us are more equal than others. And site planning is absolutely essential. Mm-hmm. And economic modeling and economic analysis is absolutely essential, as is transportation planning. Impact statements and ecological quality are not that essential. They're essential to have, not to follow.
Well, in my own philosophy, it would be impossible for a person to do a site plan without some knowledge of the environmental impact.
Yeah, but that's the degree thing. There's always some knowledge, and the wording is always there. It's in Colombia, they one of their major goals was to respect the land, and I think if you look at Colombia and compare it to other places, they definitely did respect the land. But if you really know what happened here, they really didn't respect the land. Mm-hmm. It's that type of thing.
Is there any likelihood of McCarg also being retained to do the land planning for the Woodlands? And that would be, his firm is certainly capable of doing that as well as doing environmental impact statement.
Well, I don't know enough about the Woodlands specifically. I know McCarg charges a fortune.
Sure does.
And
I used to be his student, and when I was, he went broke because he charged so little, but now he's famous.
He's making up for it, yeah. So I don't know if that's a possibility, but I don't. Sure, it's a possibility if one wants to put out the money.
That would be a way of implementing this.
Yes, but it's a matter of commitment again, a matter of money.
Beverly?
How does the environmental impact statement affect the man-made lakes here in Columbia?
Well, they have a number of problems with the lakes, and I think one of the reasons is they just build the lakes. The story goes, and I don't know how true it is really, but the story goes that they hired an ecologist, and names aren't important, to fly the area to see where a lake should go. And anybody would have put the lake there because it was right in it followed the stream and was a depression. So all you had to do was dam it at one end and dig it out and put the lake there. And that's what they did. And they put the lake there. I think they've dredged that lake 3 or 4 times since it's been in. The E. coli count, okay, I'll go back a minute. They had to dredge the lake 3, which has cost them, I think, 20 to 40 or 50,000 bucks a shot to do it. And that's because of poor planning. The E. coli count, E. coli is the name of a bacterium that's, you all know this? Yeah.
Some do, some
Okay.
don't.
It's a name of a bacterium that is found in feces that is an indicator organism for pollution. In itself, it's nothing, but when they have a high concentration of that, they indirectly assume that things like viral hepatitis and other type of baddies are in the water. The E. coli count was extremely high in Kittamakundi, which is out here. It was extremely high in Wild Lake, so that if you fell out of a rowboat, I mean, you can't swim in it, but if you fell out of a rowboat, that wasn't good either. And, part of that was attributable to Agnes and what happened with the overflow, but part of it is just that stuff is getting into that lake that shouldn't be getting in. And there are a number of other things. And there's a lot of erosion, a lot of siltation. That's why they have to dredge it.
Are they overused in the summer too?
I can't say they're overused, but you can't get a boat. Oh, no, I don't. I know how that means to sound that way. They're very busy. The boats are usually, at least we found that it's, if you want a sailboat or a canoe, you have to wait online.
That does not contribute to pollution, basically.
I didn't mean, yeah.
I mean, no power boats.
There are no power boats in the lake.
It's sailboats, rowboats, and so on.
But just being small and being warm is what you used to contribute.
Well, they do have a eutrophication problem. Matter of fact, you can see it if you look at your window here. And that's due, as you know, you don't know. Eutrophication just means enrichment with nutrients, and what that generally is due to is runoff that includes such things as phosphorus and nitrogen from the land, and that contributes to plant growth. It's a natural process, but man has facilitated, as they say, the process, and it eventually kills lakes. It's what's happening in Lake Erie. And that's happening out here and to some degree in Wild Lake. And these are very young lakes. And of course, if you hear the rhetoric, it's that each time, I think the last 2 or 3 times they've dredged the lake, they've said, this is absolutely the last time from now on because of the stabilization of the complexes and on. Dredge the lake again next year. So.
I'd like to go back to the transportation thing and ask what kinds of mass transit were discussed before this town was built and why they built it around the automobile.
I'm not the one to answer that. I can probably only repeat what was said before. They did consider putting a monorail-like system in Columbia, and the Bendix Corporation did a feasibility study for them. The cost became prohibitive, and as they postponed it, it became more and more prohibitive. My own feeling is that the developers really wanted this to be a success, and one of the ways they were going to make it a success was to have conventional transportation, and another way was to have conventional housing. One of the things that fouled up Reston was the so-called innovative architecture that there really wasn't a market for, and so Columbia was very conservative. And I don't blame them for that. I think they had to be. I'm not the guy to ask for the different modes of transportation. I just a joke.
I can add one point. I don't know if you're aware of this, but at the transportation system was initially studied under a combination Columbia Association Department of Transportation grant. And when they came up for refunding, which would have been the step of actually designing the hardware in order to put in this system. This happened about the same time all the urban programs were cut back, about 4 years ago, and consequently the grant wasn't renewed. And without outside financing, it's just one of those things that, that's public transportation is something that a developer couldn't economically handle.
Are there any new towns that are built around something other than the auto? Any place?
Yeah, in Scandinavia.
Could that be done here, or if not, why
If
not?
we were socialistic.
Disney World.
Right.
You gotta have higher
Disney
density.
World.
Well, any place where
That's
they've had
different
mass
ballgame.
transit that's been successful is because they've had high density, or much higher than they have here.
Disney World's as close as you come. Right.
Yeah, but they got a rip-off.
Yeah, but it's.
You pay $1 every time you get on it.
It does sound funny, but if you've ever been there, regardless of what it's doing to the aquifers and other things, which I'm sure are serious, but that monorail through that city and the no cars there, if they could do that, it's a thrilling thing.
What's the transportation mode in Tapio?
Is that a monorail out from downtown?
Transportation system in Tapiola is a bus system.
Bus.
But they are in the process of putting in a subway system.
Subway.
It's a very, very good bus system. It runs every 2.5 minutes from Tapiola to the downtown, which is about 7 kilometers away. It's an excellent system. I've been there and have used it, and
I know that people can get out and back very easily.
Pardon?
People can get out and back very easily.
Right.
It's
And
like
they
the
are
anti-
putting in a subway now.
It's like the antiquated subway system of Manhattan. You can still get around like crazy in Manhattan, let's face it.
Relatively few cars around Tapiola.
Yes.
Environment.
What kind of legislation would it take? I mean, could it be done now in this country?
With federal funding.
Yeah. And can that be pushed somehow? Or?
You're the generation that's going to do that. Ours is dead.
See how committed your congressman is on Wednesday when you visit him, and you'll have a barometer as to
Check it out with Fraser. Other questions?
If you want to ask general questions to any of us, maybe that's the thing to do, and maybe we can answer some as a resident, and some we can say we really don't know, but.
Is it possible to make a lake that will be a good lake?
Oh, yeah.
It is possible to do that. What would be the prerequisites to go out there?
Oh, I guess first you have to find the right area, and you'd have to
Let me put it this way.
stabilize the.
Let me phrase it this way. Why is wherever this one is the wrong area?
It's not the wrong area. It's an obvious area for a lake. It's just that the sides weren't adequately stabilized, the rocks weren't put in the right way, or artificial chemicals weren't sprayed. Soil types weren't considered. These are highly erodible soils, and they did do that. And of course, as that happened, trees then began to die. Runoff has to be diverted adequately, which it really wasn't done here. Sewage outfall has to be diverted, which is being done in the west right now, and their lakes are coming alive again because eutrophication is stopping. And those things have to be considered, and they have to be considered at a serious level. I couldn't plan that myself. I just know it has to be done, but there are people who can do it.
As an ecologist, could this lake be rejuvenated by draining it and starting over again?
Oh, yeah, but once again, it's like putting a monorail.
It could be done, though.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Shallow lakes are much easier to rejuvenate than deep.
Yeah, well, it's a matter of, I guess, what you have to do with the most space. The trouble with shallow lakes is that the sun filters to the bottom, and eutrophication happens very, very quickly. Yeah.
I mean, relatively shallow, like lakes that are 50 feet deep are easier to rejuvenate.
Oh, that
than lakes
shallow.
that are 4
Well, that's a deep lake for around. I think this is 15 feet at its deepest. I think that's right.
I would like to talk about game a little bit. Since game has sort of been a host here, I don't know, students would like to know a little more about AIM. That's kind of interesting.
Look at the excitement.
After a long day. I'm not going to push it either. It's up to the student, I guess. What they want. Do you have any big selling brochure about it so that we can take home with us and read it?
Not really. We just, we be. pretty much. You want to talk about it, Bob?
Can I ask one more thing about the
Yeah, let's go back to the environment.
I've kind of found that environmental questions very often come down to what the consumer wants and what he knows about it. And it comes down to education, I guess. And the question is, what can you do or what are you doing in Columbia about that, about educating the people? It seems like, because of the wealth of this community, maybe there's not, that they don't care or whatever. I don't know. That's a reason.
No, I can answer the latter point easily. I think people care. I don't know if they care more. I think because of the wealth, they maybe care a little more because it's correlated with a higher educational level, etc. But it's very hard to educate people about something they really don't care that much about. They've got other concerns and other problems, and the newspaper is full of environmental issues. There's a Council of Environmental Quality in Howard County that they write articles in the paper every week. And every time the lake is drained, they explain exactly why the lake is. I must read the word eutrophication, and because I read that stuff anyhow. But these are in popular journals, maybe 4 or 5 times a week. And every time I ask somebody what it means, because I just do that, nobody knows. And I'm not answering your question, but I don't know how you educate people. It's difficult. You need a background, you need training in it, you have to really care, you have to really think you can do something, and I don't know.
I guess that, like a lot of the other aspects of a new America or some kind of utopia, has to happen early, like in elementary school, and that's where the programs have to start. And, are they doing that? I suppose it's like up to an individual teacher or something. I don't know.
I think that's
a model.
Well, that's nationwide, and that is happening, and that's real. And I think that the so-called younger generation, I'm talking about 8-year-olds now, that it's going to be a significant change. If I can judge from my son and his friends and people I've seen, they really know something. Someone else? No.
Yeah.
Well, this is something I've been trying to get a handle on since we flew out here. Dr. Ferguson mentioned it, but what was it again? Useful uses of disorder?
Oh, the uses of disorder.
The uses of disorder.
The new book, Uses of Disorder.
Maybe in an environmental context, maybe you got some ideas on it, but if you look at it, it's the larger environment, the ecosystem, that seems to be so tranquil. Really, it's a series of conflicting subsystems running against each other, and the one system, the grass is replaced by bushes, is replaced by trees, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder, in terms of the system that's been imposed through the Grand Columbia process, I guess in walking around here, and maybe we haven't done all that much walking around, but we've been hit with an awful lot of visual images and feelings and things like that in the last couple of days. I guess I've been walking around looking for the garishness and maybe in part the ugliness, which in part is diversity, that makes up most of the places that I guess I've considered communities. The kind of life and antagonism and criticism and conflict that just almost doesn't let you be, and very definitely is not controlled by anyone, but rather goes on continually. And here I get the feeling that underneath it all or above it all, whatever philosophical order you want to take it, that things are kind of floating along under a great unseen hand. And that even the new architecture, it has rounded corners. And even the colors may be new, but they're nice. And, all these other things. There's no garbage cans sitting out. There's no alleys. There's no obscenities scratched on a telephone pole. Or
no
like
telephone pole.
Yeah, no telephone. I thought telephone poles came with things, 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper taped on them. But what about that? I don't know. I don't think I'm morbid in the sense that I'm looking for that kind of thing, but walking around Cedar Riverside, it kind of gives me a feeling that things are changing, and I can kind of guess at, what's the latest thing by what the bulletin board telephone poles are coming.
I'm not sure I understand. I'm trying to relate to something that I'm not sure I can. Are you talking about sterility?
Well, if that's the words you want to use,
well,
I guess I sense that here.
Yeah, there's sterility here. I think a lot of people sense it, and I think it bothers a lot of people, but I think that the trade-offs are worth it. You know, what are the trade-offs? For a single guy or girl in college right now, the trade-offs wouldn't be worth it at all. But if you happen to be upper middle class, you happen to have a wife and a few kids and a dog and a fish, and you have a pre-service plan with all the recreation that you could possibly want, and the crime is practically non-existent, and there are some trees, and there isn't any air pollution to speak of, and there are lakes to swim in, and I can go on, then the trade-offs are clear, and you're sacrificing stability, because you really, that's not a significant thing. But if you're into urban living and you're into things that are going on that used to be more important to me than they are now, then you couldn't pay me to come here. But right now, it's tough to get me to leave. So that's the best way I can answer it.
You know, an example of that, stuff is compacted time-wise so much, I'm sure it's difficult for you to remember. But when Jerry was talking to you yesterday, Jerry Goethe, when you were doing your debriefing in the afternoon, I don't know whether you were catching some of the signals that he was putting out, but some of them were, you know, I was home in Chicago, and a struggle that he's having as a person, and it's not he alone, it's his wife with him. The kids aren't there now. They've been here long enough. He has 2 little girls. The Columbia is home for them. He and his wife struggle over kind of, I think, what you have capsulized there. Because for him, life and vitality included struggle and death and life and resurrection, as it was all epitomized in the city of Chicago and all of the crap that goes with it, you know. But that brought with it its own kind of hope. And, you know, Jerry is struggling with his own commitment to try to make this thing alive and real, and you know, it's getting to the point where he's starting to say, maybe I'm coming home when I come here. Now that may be partly because he's 32 years old, and 6 years ago he was 24, 25 on the streets of Chicago, and he ain't 24, 25 anymore. You know, that may be part of it, but the other part of it is, you know, this sterility, the trade-off, the unreality, and Jerry's the handball champion of Columbia. You know, so it doesn't mean he doesn't like the goodies.
May I add something to that? A lot of people, when they first come to Columbia, let's say externally, experience exactly what you're talking about. Now, I'm down from the University of Maryland, and I'm a little older than most of the other students, but I get the feel that same comment from them. But the longer they come back, even the young ones, the more they like it, because there's more to this than meets the surface. You don't need the obscenities. I lived in Europe. I've been in Japan. I've walked through the streets of Tokyo any time of the day or night, no lights, and felt absolutely safe. And that is much of a city. It had the excitement, the life that you have anywhere. And we are part here of the Baltimore metropolitan system. We're part of that excitement. If you want to go to Baltimore, or Baltimore, I think I'm supposed to say.
Baltimore.
Baltimore. You have to learn the local dialect in order to really be a part of it.
M-E-R-E.
But you're not in a vacuum. You are part of this total metropolitan system. I mean, we cheer for the coach, you know. I mean.
No, sir.
All right.
Some of us cheer for the Redskins.
Yeah, but see, we're part of that same complex too.
Sorry,
I think there's more to it than just what you see on the surface. There's a lot of life going on here that isn't apparent because the city hasn't reached its full maturity yet. And until it does, I think you will miss a lot of that.
That's one thing I've been thinking about. I suspect we're in a common spot city that's been in existence for only 5 years, 6 years. And it used to be a city of 100,000. But different, and begins to develop at this rate. And then you're going to have tensions between the past and the present and the emerging future.
I think that's what I was trying to get at this afternoon when we were talking about some of the amenities. If you talk pre-servicing, probably in terms of what I know in the area of the country that I travel, which is fairly extensive, for just what, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when there were 6,000, 7,000 people here. Per 6,000 or 7,000 people here, there were more things available to do and to be involved in terms of pre-servicing kinds of things than, wow, any place that I know. I was in Boca Raton, Florida, when it was 6,900, and when it was 25,000 when I left, we didn't have a community swimming pool. We had a lot of private swimming pools, but we didn't have a community swimming pool. And I know that when this town had, what, 7,000 residents, it had its third neighborhood pool going. And then you talk about what can be, the discotheques and all of that. It's that economic balance. How soon can you come in with it to make it feasible? Who's willing to risk the money to do it? Would you like to open a discotheque today? You know, you got the money to do it, come and do it. You want to open a hamburger joint or a fish restaurant or a family restaurant where you can get a meal for $3? Come on in and do it, but you better have your economic plan worked out.
I think a lot of people are willing to let the developer do a lot of the risking. To some extent, I suppose, the mindset might be that Jim Rouse is a benevolent Big Daddy and we're living on his plantation, and as long as a lot of things are serviced, we grumble about certain things, but by and large, the trade-offs are better than what we want to grumble for. And you know, we might get upset, but then often Jim Rouse himself will come personally, and you know, the language may change. Now that'll change as we get bigger, I suppose, but to a certain extent, I suppose we're on a plantation, and we sort of feel that, or even maybe a little bit of benevolent despot in a feudal system. Analogies here and there you might draw in the point of development that we now are. And a lot of people get upset about things, but they don't risk a lot about them or keep at it over their staying power as it go along either.
Your question generated another thought. I had recently seen a CBS News something or other, and it was a good show, and they talked about how Americans generally feel that where they are at any particular time is the best place in the world to be. And they showed on the 4th of July or on the 5th of November, the flag waving, parade type, mini-skirted, baton twirling phenomena. And they said that this was particularly incredible because of the mobility of our society, where one person moves every 4 years type of thing. And I think a lot of that's in Colombia too, so that although the sterility factor may be a real factor to those who are looking from the outside, it's not a real factor because those of us who are living here wish not to think about it. And I don't know how true that is, but I think there's something there.
Is there any more positive way than bringing a lawsuit against the Department of Housing and Urban Development to maybe have the developer look a little more carefully at some of the environmental impacts of a project?
You can't bring a lawsuit against them.
Oh, some people that.
Well, you can. I would say that you really. I don't say you can't. You can bring a lawsuit against anybody. I think you'd have a hell of a job. I think that with pressure, that type of pressure, you could get more of a response than you could without it. But it's such a subjective thing, and the interpretation of impact statements are generally that. I'm not familiar with the specification talking about that. It would be difficult. But I do think, generally statements are getting better, and they're going to be adhered to and listened to. That's a vague non-answer, but that's the best I can do.
Yeah.
Getting back to environmental impact, you have to think about pollution, air pollution. And like the city where I come from, it's really bad.
Which is?
Cleveland. You can't see.
Dive in the lake and you get a bump on your head. Yeah, I know.
Just like the bus system, transit system here isn't working, and people are using their cars. And when there is a higher density, when the city finally grows to its capacity, there will be an air pollution problem if people persist on using their cars.
That's true.
So So is there an environmental impact statement to this effect here?
Eric and I disagree on this a little bit, but I'll let him talk first.
I don't know how we could. I don't know if I don't have my own feelings on it. I'm thinking of it as I'm telling you. So.
Cars, man, cars.
There have been a few studies done on the amount of cars, projected cars, that would go through here when Columbia is complete, when the roads are expanded to 46 lanes and that type of thing. And, you know, it's hard to project whether they'll really be, at this stage, you can't really make an impact statement, because if the air pollution guidelines are adhered to, they really shouldn't be a problem in the future. If they're not, there will be a problem. And what's going to happen if there is a problem is that it's going to be a deep post facto or after the fact thing again, and people are going to say, geez, we've got an air pollution problem right now, how the hell do we stop it? And I guess I can't answer that. I mean, I can give you solutions to it, but I can't give you real solutions. They can tell people who live in Columbia that they can only have one car, or they can prevent people from coming into the mall, but, you know, that's just not real.
No, I'm saying that if they start now.
You can't really start now, that's the problem. There are too many variables and contingencies, and anything you say will justifiably be knocked down. Somebody might project 4 million cars coming through in 1 year. Somebody might say, I think 2 million. Somebody might say, well, if the specific regulations are adhered to and 2 million go through in 8 years, that will cut down the carbon removal to this level, and that's not a problem. And the other thing is, no one knows what's a problem. FDA says 0.5 parts per million of mercury is a problem, and how do they get that figure? And how much carbon dioxide? And I'm not knocking your question, it's a good one, but these things just aren't known. So no, an impact statement right now wouldn't stand up, wouldn't hold any water.
What was the awful smell this morning?
Garbage.
It was before the showers you took?
Go like this. Not you, you have a motel room, I understand that, yeah.
No, it was a very strange smell this morning when we came out of the motel. It seemed a little like dead fish almost. And I also noticed it at the church.
I came out, I came out of the house this morning and noticed it, and I thought it was the fact that in our little cul-de-sac townhouses, it was one of our 2 garbage pickup days, and somebody threw a dead cat out that had been, you know, deteriorating for 3 or 4 weeks, and it had that kind of odor to it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it was
all over
unidentified, very sour.
It was all over.
Don't know what it was.
That was the west side smell. East side, we didn't have that smell.
Today wasn't garbage day. Yeah, no, I don't know. Yeah, that's interesting, because that's the first time I've noticed that in a year and a half that I've lived here.
It's very strong by the motel.
Almost like a sugar beet factory in northern Ohio when they were producing.
Yeah.
Over in Fremont, it used to drift over to Cleveland. I lived in Fremont for a while, I understand that.
This is really not on the subject of environment or anything like that, but I was noticing yesterday that talking to people and, you know, in our group and stuff about, you know, your churches, you know, they seem very liberal, I mean, to me. And I was wondering if the people here, you know, if they're all just really liberal people, or if they have some, you know, really fundamental straight people, you know, and they go outside the church, or maybe there's some, you know, church that is very straight and fundamental.
Eric?
That's an ecological question.
I'll pass the question, but I'm one of those very liberal types who wouldn't go to church in any community.
Except you almost went last night. Or Saturday night.
So
May I put a comment on that?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
All right. I'll just relate it to the previous election. Columbia voted 60% for McGovern. Does that pretty well give you an idea?
It doesn't really say it, though.
No, not
because what you have in the area of Columbia, not Columbia, but in the area of Columbia, you have options. Right down Route 29 is a Presbyterian church which functions out of a basically fundamentalistic Presbyterian background, almost moderately.
I would say it's very conservative.
Yeah, very conservative group. And they're growing, they're flourishing, and they're feeding on people in Columbia who are dissatisfied with the church structures that are emerging in Columbia. You have a wide range of options. I think one of the strengths that I see in CCM is that a number of the churches who are in the environs of Columbia have become a part of the Columbia Cooperative Ministry, and people in Columbia do have an option. Now, which of you went to the Lutheran service at Interfaith Center Sunday? Okay. You were involved in the straight liturgy of the Missouri Synod that happens on alternate Sundays in the Interfaith Center. My perception of that, as one who's non-Missouri Synod oriented by background, is that that's a pretty loose service. I mean, it's pretty free, functioning out of the framework of the traditional, so that the traditional symbols are there for those who are feeding on them, and you can touch base with that kind of tradition. If you were here next week, you would probably find a group with guitars and, you know, much livelier kind of a thing that you might groove on more and so on. So that on the other hand, then you have a Floyd Schaefer who's functioning out of an older Howard County congregation over here, who was able to do a thing like the clown liturgy on Saturday night, which was wild, but comes back on Sunday morning. If you attended his straight service that he would do on the late service on Sunday morning, you would say that Lukey's service at 9 o'clock was kind of a free-flowing liturgy, and Floyd was pretty straight down the line. And you have a mix then of older Howard County people and people from Columbia who have the option to choose that which touches their tradition a little more strongly and tends to function that way. Is that kind of fair, Bob, as local parish pastor? You really do have options.
They're not, I think we tend to be more innovative and experimental as a total group than another total group someplace. As an overall.
Yeah, I think that's true, but it doesn't take away the options for that which is quite straight and traditional. Yeah.
What's the purpose of AIM and where do you get your money?
From you.
Don't we have any of the sheets too? That
Yeah, I don't. We could get some out tomorrow, I guess. AIM is a kind of a, I suppose I'd designate it as a para-religious structure outside of the institutional church that kind of emerged out of some needs that were existent. As a number of us, and that was pre my arrival here, so I'll talk about it from that standpoint, saw what was happening both in the Columbia development and how this new town made an effort to relate to the church. We became aware of the fact that in new towns, as in other places, but the new town phenomenon accentuates the difficulty of trying to say, how do we address the church? And very simply, if you look at pre-planning, which is really interesting, in terms of Title VII and so on, you have to have all of this information ahead of time. You got to do pre-planning. And a developer will tend to go along and say, okay, I've got to do these kinds of things. I have to do my physical planning, I have to do social institutional planning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually someone raises the question, well, what are you going to do with the church? And at that point, they start screaming and tearing their hair out and saying, who do you talk to? Who is the church? The church is either, if you're talking inter-Protestant or inter-Christian or interfaith, you finally come up with the answer that it's a multi-headed monster that you can't address. You don't know who to talk to. You can't talk to the National Council of Churches and be talking to the church. You can't talk to the archdiocese of any given area and be talking to the church. You can't talk to any Jewish league of any kind, because you got 3 major divisions in that group, and be talking to the church. There really isn't anybody to talk to be the church. And so basically AIM kind of is a group of arrogant guys who said that we're going to incorporate and try to help people address the question of how do you deal with the church. And the reason that we have had some success in this in terms of consulting with Newtown developers, and we've done it with the Woodlands, a little bit in Peachtree, Maumelle, Arkansas, with church executives trying to address this whole question, is that we are not commissioned by an institution to do what we're doing. We're doing it because we have a commitment to be who we are. The AIM group is 7 guys right now. It's been 8 at times, it's been 6 at times, it could be any number, it doesn't matter, who are willing to put this as a part of the package of their volunteer services because I have a commitment to it. We bought a place in this urban life center scene to be able to interact with people of different disciplines, like Eric, to learn a little bit about environmental impact, and R.P. Brown Associates, and Land Ventures, and folks like that. But it costs money to do it, you know. You couldn't come with a tin cup in your hand, and so we pay a pretty heady price. The square footage in this building isn't cheap. It's, what is it now, 8 1/4 square foot, $8.50 a square foot, you know, to be here, plus membership fees and stuff like that. So that what we decided to do was to keep our full-time jobs that we have, and all members of AIM get their bread from someplace else. None of us take any bread out of stuff that we do for AIM, but we take the money that we get from consultations to kind of pay the rent and the membership to be able to be a part of this mix. And the arrogance is that we happen to have an environment where we can learn to talk some languages and to get into that kind of a situation where we can do things like we're doing here, and to help developers know who to begin to talk to if you're going to try to get church groups to get their heads together and decide what they want to do or what not to do. And that's what we live on. We're committed to be able to die tomorrow. It's very easy because we don't have an ongoing institution. If we were getting bread out of it, if my salary depended on AIM, this consultation wouldn't go the way it is now, because half of the time, any good consultant, and Eric knows this, any good consultant who has a consultation spends a portion of his time making sure that he sets up another consultation before he's done. That's one of the rules of the game, I think. You may be freer than that. You're getting out of it, okay. But the professional consultants who go out really have to deal with groups in order to get ongoing consultations. So they will do 3/4 of the job that they're called to do to make sure that the other quarter will produce another full job out of which they can do 3/4 so they can get another job. That's the survival technique. And I think that, frankly, the way I view AIM, the lucky thing that we're into is that we're not into that, because the only thing that could happen to us right now is that we close the office. And that wouldn't be any sweat to any of us, because we all have full-time jobs. And that's where we come out of.
Where we got the money was we got some seed money.
From a couple of denominations to get us going. And, Southern Baptists, LCA, ALC. Put a little seed money in to get us going.
And we put ourselves on an economic model of 2 years. If we weren't self-supporting of the office and the venture, then it wasn't worth it.
Question, is a relatively non-participating Unitarian. I wonder if we've reached the end of the day.
I think we're very close to it, except the bus doesn't come until 9:30.